Well, hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Brenda Hawes, and we have Brenda Allen also assisting in the background here. She'll be helping us when we review our polling questions. Today, we're going to be talking about don't take your work stress home with you. This is a topic that seems to have generated a lot of interest. We have a lot of participants planning to join us today, so thank you for being on the call with us as well. Along the way, we'll be having several polling questions that you'll be able to respond to. Also, I'll be leaving about 10 minutes at the end for questions, comments, opportunities to give feedback or just to chime in about something you may want some clarification about. A couple of little housekeeping items as we get started. We will be sending the PowerPoint presentation out after the presentation is over. Also, all of our webinars are hosted on our website, www.myrbh.com. We also have a YouTube channel that you can be checking out as well. So let's go ahead and move into the presentation. The information also at that website is right there on the page as you're seeing. So let's move into talking a little bit about what our objectives are today. We're going to start to identify what is stress and how do I recognize it when I have stressors in my life. How do I respond to the stressors? What do I need to do to cope effectively? And how do I balance work and family? And we're going to also talk about what is resiliency. And Brenda will be assisting me in moving the slides along, so you'll get to see those as we move through the presentation. So when we talk about the objectives, one of the things that's always helpful as we're talking about stress or when we're talking about anything is the more we can ask ourselves questions, gives the mind and the brain something to kind of contemplate and percolate. So it's the process of inquiry and contemplation and really tuning in that helps us get the kind of clarity that can be really helpful to us. So what is stress? Basically, stress is the reaction of your body to the amount of stress that's placed on it. And we all have experienced stress. We all have different ideas about what stress is. And the more stress that we have going on in our lives, or the more things we have going on, the more changes we have going on at any given time, the more likely we are to be experiencing stress. And it's the one thing in life that we can all count on. It's the one thing that's the inevitable and isn't about whether we have it or don't have it. It's about how we manage it when it comes our way. So a good way to think about it is stress occurs. It happens to all of us. And sometimes people think, what's the matter with me that I'm feeling so much stress? Well, it's not that there's something that's the matter with you. It's an indication that there's something that's going on that maybe you need to be paying greater attention to. And when we're looking at stress, the thing to think about is that the body lets us know when we're under stress. The stress mechanism is our survival mechanism. It's the mechanism that lets us know when danger is present or that we need to be alert, we need to be protecting ourselves, we need to be paying attention to what's happening in our environment and what's going on around us. The thing that happens when we're under stress is that the body releases hormones. It releases cortisol, cortisone, and adrenaline. And those are the hormones in the body that dump all these hormones into the system to prepare us to outrun the tiger. So when we activate our stress response, we might be dumping in a little bit of cortisol, a little bit of adrenaline, or a lot, depending on how we're responding to the situation. And these are naturally occurring hormones in the body that tell the body, okay, time to prepare, time to outrun the tiger, time to prepare yourself for danger or a situation that maybe you're not prepared for. And so when we're looking at stress, you can say, okay, I might have this situation that I'm really excited about, for example, a wedding or childbirth, or you might have a situation that's really scary or really sad, maybe grief, loss. No matter what the situation is, it can be stressful, whether it's a happy event or a sad event. And because what happens when we're going through a change or an event like this is that the body is, having to make some adaptations. The body's having to adjust to it. So, for example, if you have a death of a spouse, that maybe is going to register really high on a stress scale, whereas if you have a minor law violation, maybe that's going to register low on a stress scale. There's something called the Holmes-Ray stress test or the life change scale test that you can actually go online, you can download it, you can look at it. What you'd see is that death of a spouse registers at a scoring of 100 points on the stress test. A divorce is going to register at like about a 73. Pregnancy registers at a 40. Vacation registers at a 12. Christmas, getting ready for Christmas is at a 12. So depending on the event, there's a certain rating level, and so you can go online and print out or download that test. You could take it and kind of have a little opportunity to do an inventory of just where am I. It's a great little way to take stock, and you can see there that even things that you might think of as exciting and shouldn't, and a lot of people think, oh, if there's an exciting event coming up or something I'm really looking forward to, you don't necessarily think of it as being something that's stressful, but it is, because it's change. And whenever we're going through a significant change, the body has a reaction to it. And the body doesn't lie. It lets us know that there are things going on that we need to be paying attention to. And so that paying attention is going to mean not only looking at paying attention physically, but also psychologically as well. Sometimes it might be little things in our environment that affect us. It might be noise. It might be clutter. Sometimes people are really sensitive to noises. Now, one of the things that we're learning as we're doing more sensory motor trainings with young children is that some young children, when they're overstimulated or have a lot of noise in their environment, it really impacts their psychological and emotional well-being. Sometimes people are really impacted by clutter in their environment. Some of the Japanese principles of feng shui show that people that have a really cluttered environment, it affects their energy system. It affects their ability to really focus and pay attention. Other stressors, as I mentioned, it might be holidays. It might be trying to get everybody together and family and all the expectations around gifts and who to see and what to do and parties and food. So that can be really, really, really challenging as well. One of the most significant things to think about when you're thinking about stress is it has to do with the way we interpret the events in our life and the decisions that we make about things that come our way. For example, today I made a little trip over to the Department of Motor Vehicles to renew my driver's license that I had lost. And I got to DMV, and usually they open at 8 o'clock, but today they just so happened to open at 9 o'clock. So when that happened, I had this choice to make. I had a choice to make about how I want to interpret this situation. Did I want to get frustrated? Did I want to feel inconvenienced? Did I want to feel irritated? Or was I going to kind of see it as an opportunity to kind of look at, okay, how am I going to respond to this? I get to make a choice about how I respond. So my response was, oh, okay, it's not open today. I'm going to make arrangements and I'm going to go back tomorrow, and then kind of let it be rather than kind of moan and groan and feel inconvenienced and complain. There's lots of different ways that we can respond to situations that come our way. We don't have control over what comes our way, but what we do have is control over the ability and how we respond to them. The more stresses we have in our life, the more we're likely to be vulnerable and the more we're likely to be impacted. When we're talking about stress, there are lots of different ways that we're impacted. And that can be physically, it can be emotionally, it can be intellectually, it can be behaviorally, relationally, on lots and lots of different levels. And the idea is to pay attention to it when it first comes our way, because the more we push it away and the more we resist it, that which we resist persists. And I think of it a lot of times as like a Mount St. Helens. I'm here in Portland, Oregon, and we have lovely Mount St. Helens that erupted 20, 30 years ago, and actually in the early 80s. And so once we just pressure in the earth built and built and built, and eventually there was nowhere else for that pressure to go, so the volcano erupted. And the same is true for us. The more stress and the more pressure, the more we hold inside without having some avenues of release, some avenues of expression, then we erupt. And that eruption can happen on a lot of different levels. And we're all vulnerable to different kinds of reactions depending on our own particular vulnerability and our own particular circumstances. For some people then, that stress is going to impact us more on a physical level. So that might show up as high blood pressure. It might show up as breathing difficulties. It might be digestive problems. It might be irritable bowel. It might be fatigue. It might be migraine headaches. It might be tension headaches. It could be skin rashes. As a counselor, and having worked as a counselor for the last 40 years, I really firmly believe that all physical and kind of chronic illnesses can have some basis and root in stress. And I'm going to tell you how that happens in a minute. So the body doesn't lie. The body lets us know something is going on. So when the body's talking to us, it's really, really, really important to pay attention. Because if we're not paying attention to it when it's first starting to talk to us, it ups the ante. And that noise gets louder and louder and louder until we attend to it and pay attention to it. So for some people, it isn't going to show up as a physical health thing. It's going to show up more emotionally. And emotionally, it could show up as something like depression. Depression is lack of interest in the usual activities of daily living, fatigue, low energy, not feeling like doing things. It's low mood. It's sometimes having thoughts about wanting to die. It's a more extreme position, kind of in the sort of the scale of mental emotional concerns. It might be anxiety. Anxiety is future orientation and time thinking. It's worrying about something in the future, and that future isn't here yet. So when we have something like anxiety, or it can even be depression, but let's just take anxiety as an example, just to kind of bring this home a little bit, is if I'm having an anxious thought of, oh my gosh, I'm going to get fired from my job. Let's just use that as an example, because I hear that from employees a lot. They're worried that they're underperforming. They're worried that they're, not going to make their 90-day probation, and so they're worried, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my job. So when somebody has a thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my job, that's a future orientation and time thinking. That's worrying about something in the future, and that future isn't here yet. So when we have that worry thought, the worry thought of, my child's, going to get hurt if they go and play with a friend, or my spouse doesn't love me anymore, what happens is we dump all this adrenaline and cortisol into the system, because it's attached to some of these worry thoughts. Sometimes it can become a survival thought as well. And so when we dump all that adrenaline and cortisol into the system, after a while, it begins to take an impact on our immune system, because our immune system then has to go in and clean up all that adrenaline and cortisol that's now running rampant in the system. I like to think of it as a little bit like that game Pac-Man. Have any of you played Pac-Man before? Pac-Man's that little game where you have all these little ghosts that are jumping around, and Pac-Man's job is to come along and clean them up. Well, imagine that all those little ghosts are adrenaline and cortisol, and Pac-Man has to come along and clean them up. Well, pretty soon, Pac-Man can't get all those little ghosts that are jumping around. That's your immune system trying to come in then and clean up all that adrenaline and cortisol, eventually your immune system gets compromised, and then it's not available in the same way to fight the bacteria and natural invaders that it's really designed to take care of in the system. So that's how our emotional state and the way we think about things can impact our physical. Then we have behavioral. That's going to be sleep disturbances. It's going to be changes in our appetite. It's going to be changes in our relationships. A lot of times it might mean misuse of substance, engaging in addictive behaviors, whether it's misuse of substances, drugs, alcohol, gambling, pornography, internet, under or overeating. There's lots of different ways that that can show up behaviorally. Shows up relationally as well. Relational is another really big one. So sometimes when we're under stress, we take out our stress and frustration on the people that we love the most because they're the least likely to leave us. The problem with that, though, is that they don't like it. So let's move on then into our one of our polling questions. You know, I'm having a little bit of trouble here with being connected up to the system, and so I'm just going to kind of keep moving through this because I'm not able to see the screen that you're able to see. And I really apologize for that. I'm not sure what's kind of happening with the technology here, if I got kicked out of my system as we've been talking, or what's happening here. But let me just kind of keep moving through it, and I'm going to throw out the polling question, and then you can put your answers in there, and then I'll give you just a minute, and then I'll review what the answer is. So stress can have a major impact on physical well-being, mental, intellectual well-being, emotional well-being, relational well-being, or all of the above. So just take a minute to check in about that and put your answer in there.
Hi, Brenda. This is Brenda. I just closed the first poll, and it looks like we have 99% of participants voting for number 5, all of the above.
Oh, all right. Thank you, Brenda. It's great to hear your voice chiming in there. And that is the answer, all of the above. All right. So one of the things that we think about when we're attending to stress is that we really have to make sure that we're attending to our basic needs. Because as we're attending to our basic needs, that's how we're best going to be helping manage our stress. And that's basic needs are, as you probably all know, food, air, water, shelter, but also it's about connection with others, having a sense of community, a sense that we're connected with others. And some other basic needs, too, in addition to, and then the ones that I just listed are those that were, there's a man by the name of Abraham Maslow, and he's kind of the father of this whole idea of self-actualization, that the more we can attend to, once we're able to attend to our basic needs, then we can sort of move up the chain to attend to more of our psychological needs. And but before we can really attend to more psychological thinking and things like that, we have to make sure our basic needs are being met. And sometimes there's also those basic needs to feel some sense of control, to feel challenged, to feel a sense of competency, a sense of capability, a sense to feel like we're able to do the things that we set our mind to do. We have a basic need for support, to be able to be connected with others, to be appreciated, to have a sense of gratitude. We have a basic need to be accepted. There's another need for some level of self-growth. That's a little bit higher up the chain in terms of self-actualization. We all need feedback. We need to hear from others. We need people to be willing to share their reactions and responses to us. Friendships, relationships, as I was saying, that's that sense of connection. making sure that we've got time out for ourselves, that self-time, and of course, love. That's sort of the key, because you know what love really is that love is the counterbalance to fear. And fear is really what activates the stress response. So when our fear gets activated, and that's oftentimes has to do with belief systems, old conditioning and programming, when that fear response gets activated, that's what then triggers the fear response. And as I was talking earlier, that adrenaline and cortisol that then gets dumped into the system. So one of the best ways to manage the stress and to manage this sort of the fear response is to really keep track of and check in and tune into yourself, to take a look at the way you're thinking about things. It's kind of what I was saying earlier. That's going to be the best way to really manage stress is to tune into any kind of self-defeating thoughts. And self-defeating thoughts are anytime you're having the sort of the shoulda, woulda, coulda, have to, must. Those are oftentimes self-defeating thoughts. Other examples are, life should be fair, I must be perfect, I'm not supposed to feel that way. That's a really big one. That's a really big one that I see with so many people is they, you know, so for example, yesterday, a really dear friend of mine, father was in surgery, and she said, oh, I just wish I could be stronger. I'm feeling so scared and afraid right now. He's 95 years old, and the anesthesiologist just reviewed, you know, what the complications and the risks are. I'm just so scared. And, you know, it's like my comment, you know, to her is, it's normal that you would be feeling scared and afraid. It's normal to have those feelings. It doesn't mean you're not strong. It doesn't mean you're not capable. It means that you're normal, you're human, you have feelings, you have emotions. And that's really important for us to be able to tune into. Another one is, I can't show any sign of weakness. That's a really common one, is people feel like they can't share their truth, they can't honor their true feelings because they're worried that someone's going to take advantage of them if they allow themselves to be vulnerable. Well, the truth about it is that vulnerability and sharing our vulnerability is where we can really connect with people, because it's where our pain is, it's where our fear is, it's where we can reassure and support one another. So really tuning in and checking those self-defeating thoughts, that can be a really big one. Okay, let's move along. So how do I manage my stress? And that's where we get into the reinterpreting of situations, because a lot of times we are impacted and affected by our early beliefs, our early conditioning, and our early programming. And sometimes the early beliefs that we have about ourselves, maybe, for example, some feelings of inadequacy, some feelings of not good enough. Maybe we make that decision at a young age in response to certain life circumstances that we're experiencing. But then it's time to update the program. It's just like we update our computer programs, we update applications, we're constantly updating phones. We're living in a time where we're updating everything in our environment through our technology. Well, sometimes we have to update our inner programming, our inner conditioning, and update the belief systems to begin to challenge that. And so in our next slide, is, you know, it's the question. There are lots of questions that we can ask ourselves. My three favorite questions, and they're not listed here, but I'm going to go through the ones that are listed, is whenever we want to challenge a belief system or when we want to like sort of re-examine it, my three favorite questions are, is it true? Is it really true? How did I decide this? And who said so? So it gets at what's the belief. It gives us the opportunity to challenge the belief. Also, kind of, where did it come from? What's it rooted in? You know, an example might be, you know, the parent that says to their child, you know, children are meant to be seen and not heard. Big boys don't cry. You know, you should be more sensitive. There's, you know, a lot of those kinds of messages we learn early on. All righty. So, but some other questions are, you know, what's the reality of this situation? Checking in with your family. You know, what are they perceiving about you? What are they perceiving about your current stress load? asking yourself the questions about those thoughts, the distorted questions, and also just how am I coping? How am I doing? That gets back to the questioning process as I was saying in the very beginning, is when we ask ourselves a question, even if we don't know the answer right at that time, and a lot of times you might not, let yourself percolate with it. Let yourself just sit with the not knowing and see what comes, because the answer and the information will come, especially when we don't force it, all right? So part of it is going to be and as we talk about in the next slide, examining also the work and home pressures. Do you in fact maybe have too much to do with too many things to do with the time that you have allotted? Or are you expecting some level of perfection? Or expecting things to be done just right or done just so. So that's when we want to ask ourselves, do I really need to do this? Do I really need to do all this work myself? That's a common one that you see in a work environment. People, rather than delegating duties and responsibilities, will feel like they've got to do it all themselves because it has to be done a certain way and it has to be done right. So again, it's that challenging the belief systems, challenging the way of doing things, particularly if you're noticing yourself feeling stressed and really challenged with the circumstances that are going on, then that is going to be the time to really begin to challenge. Is there another way to do this? Is there another way to think about it? So it might be that I'm going to do something different, or that I'm going to think about it in a different way, or that I'm going to feel differently about it. So let's move into some specific coping strategies. It might be in your home situation, when you're looking at what's going on at home, that you're gonna, because there's the work pressure, and then there's the home, and then there's the balance between home and work. So kind of take a look and see, where do you feel the most stress and pressure? In the home environment, it might mean calling a family meeting together. Let's talk about what we're doing, how we're doing it, and is there another way to do it? For some people, when you're having challenges with kids, with maybe chores or responsibilities, might mean putting some charts together. It might mean coming up with some allowances or some ways to get everybody in the family involved in the process of managing a household, that everybody gets to have a chore, everybody gets to have certain responsibilities, and be a part of the team and making it all work. And at times, if things don't get done, it might mean challenging. How important is this? Is this really necessary? This is a really good question that you can sometimes ask too, is when you start to feel that, urgency, or this has to get done. What's the worst that's going to happen if this doesn't get done? What's the worst that will happen? And then just keep following it up. Okay, what's the worst that would happen if that happened? And then what's the worst thing that would happen if that happened? It's kind of like peeling the layers of the onion. It gets you kind of to the middle of the core of what it is that's really going to bother, what really bothers you about it, and what's kind of the worst case scenario and the fear associated. Maybe, you're going to lower your standards, or, I see this a lot in couples relationships where one person is much tidier than the other person, and one person wants to change the other person to be kind of more like them. Well, it's a lot less stressful to either let go of that, or instead of expecting somebody else to change, then to do it oneself. Like for me, for example, I like things tidy. That's just the way I am. So rather than expecting my intimate partner to be tidy like me, I do the tidying because that's important to me, rather than and then getting stressed and wanting the other person to change to be more like me. So it may be like, again, in the home environment, you're going to plan kind of cleaning products at low impact times of the day when there's time to do those kinds of things. Sometimes in the home, you might want to hire somebody to do some of the things that you've done. For me, one of the best things that I have ever done in the last 5 years is to hire somebody to come in and mow my lawn. I don't have to worry about spark plugs, gasoline, lawnmower maintenance. So it's, again, reevaluating, constantly reevaluating. I've always done things a certain way. How do I want to do them differently? How do we as a family want to do them differently? How do I want to, have everybody be a part of participating in this? Because a lot of times parents feel like, they can't ask their kids to do chores. Yes, you can, parents can have their kids do chores. That's really important ways for them to learn a sense of responsibility and learn to manage money, maybe by paying an allowance, and then it becomes an opportunity as kids grow older to begin developing some habits around money and spending, because kids don't just learn how to manage money. They need to be taught how to do that. So that's kind of a nice way to incorporate that. Okay, so sometimes it means identifying, as we talk about on the next slide, identifying multiple demands. Sometimes we just have a lot of competing needs and a lot of competing demands. We have our parenting responsibilities, we have our financial goals and the issues related to bills and unexpected expenses. We have our work demands. We've got just demands on our time. For example, for me, when my kids, left home, I realized, oh my gosh, I have all these weekends free. I'm not spending every weekend at sporting events. And so, I mean, our time is depending on our life, our children, our family, our obligations, the things that we're involved in. Sometimes that can be really scrunched. Sometimes we're in the sandwich generation between, elder care and child care and all the needs that are in between. In addition to all that, we want to make sure that we're having our leisure time out for holidays, time out for the things that we enjoy doing, time to be socializing with our friends. Those are all really important things. So that's kind of where the balance wheel comes in our next slide. I mean, it shows you all the different areas that kind of can help us look at how our life is in balance. And it also gives us kind of a way to take stock also of the different areas and how am I kind of making time for each of these and making time in the process, making time for myself. Because a lot of times, one of the things people do is they cut back on time for themselves, or they cut back on sleep because they figure, well, I don't need to sleep right now. I will, catch up later, and then we get compromised. Our health can get compromised with that. So kind of take a look at that balance wheel and see if there's some areas maybe where you're a little out of balance, how much that out of balance may be affecting your stress level, and are there some things that you might be able to do to reevaluate that and do something different. Another key when we're thinking about stress, work and home is when we leave work, it's really important to leave work at work. And that's a tough one for a lot of people because their brain doesn't shut off when it's time to go home. They're still kind of thinking about it and planning, or there was a problem or a challenging situation and it's still kind of running around. But it is really important to let ourselves take that break. And for some people, it's more difficult than others, and depending on the level of responsibility that you have within your organization and how many other people you're reporting to and the demands of the job, it can be a very challenging thing. But that's something to be looking at, is how much does the work I take home with me, how much is that impacting my stress level? And if it is significantly impacting, are there one or two things that I could do differently? If I'm staying till 7 o'clock instead of my designated time of 5, could I leave at 6 instead? I mean, beginning the process of some small changes. Doesn't have to all happen overnight. So leaving work at work, sometimes it's having some little rituals around ending the day. It's kind of making the conscious choice. Okay, I'm going to let go of my thoughts at work. I'm going to make that transition. Some people will make a transition when they get home. They'll, say, okay, I'm going to take 5 or 10 minutes, go into my room. I'm going to change my clothes. I'm going to close the door. I'm going to let my family know, or who's ever in my home environment know. For the first 5 minutes, first 10 minutes, I'm not going to have a communication or conversation. When I've taken that moment out, made that transition, I'll come out. I'm ready. Then I'm ready to reconnect and in a refreshed and more revitalized way. So things to think about at the end of your day. Maybe you're going to use the last 20 or 30 minutes to kind of shift gears. Maybe it's going to be a to-do list for the next day. Maybe you're going to tidy up your workspace. Maybe you're going to just kind of check your calendar and see what you have coming up for the next day. Also, maybe you're just going to take a moment to think about and acknowledge and appreciate the things that you did well that day. I mean, that's oftentimes suggested as, something to think about when you go to bed at night. What is something that I feel grateful for today that happened in my life? What can I appreciate about myself and about my life and about maybe something that's happened? Sometimes visualizing the tasks of the day is completed. And the visualization is very, very, very powerful. Never underestimate the power of visualization. Having positive intentions and having visualizations can be really instrumental in helping make that be so. Sometimes when you're transitioning to home, as we talk about in the next slide, is maybe you're going to do a little pre-home exercise. Take a couple of little stretch breaks before you leave work. Do a little deep breathing to regenerate. Maybe on your way home, you're going to listen to some really beautiful music, relaxing music, or just some music that really refreshes, revitalizes, and re-energizes you as you're getting ready to shift gears. The single best way to deal with stress and to deal with challenging situations is through the breath, because the breath is free, it's readily available, it's with you 24 hours a day. You can always take that moment out to connect with it. It might just be 30 seconds, it might just be 60 seconds. The more you can kind of weave in little moments of that throughout the day, then there's going to be less of a need than to sometimes make that, than to have it be a big thing all at once. And what happens too is when we weave in the breath and taking those little moments to relax throughout the day, is we develop what I call the relaxation muscle. It's just like when you work out, you work out your bicep, your tricep, you get stronger when you work it out. When you work it, when we work our stress response, when we work our relaxation response, when we practice it, and then it's a lot more readily available to us when we call upon it. Okay? So think about what that might be for you. If I was going to take that, 30 seconds or 60, how could I fit that in my day? How could I practice that when I'm sitting at a red light driving on my way home? How could I do that when I'm on the mass transit system? Build in those opportunities. They're there. And if you have children, if you have small children or even older children, can you build it in as a family activity, maybe during a bedtime ritual with your kids? And there's lots of ways we can take care of ourselves and mentor our children along the way. We're teaching them some life skills and stress management skills. We get to do it with them. It's a shared experience, and everybody gets to feel good. Okay, so some other tips for stress reduction. Talking it out, talking to someone. That's a beautiful benefit of the EAP, having your counseling benefit, talking to someone. Some of these are just the basics. It's talking about on this slide here, the stress reduction tips. It's talking to someone, eating healthy, getting enough sleep, finding time to relax, making sure we're having fun, and really paying attention to our self-talk and really engaging in positive self-talk. So the kind of the last thing, or something that's really associating with all this, is this next slide that talks about the AAABCs of choice. And this gets back to a little bit more about what I was talking about earlier, is we don't have control over about what comes our way, but what we do have control over is the way we respond to it. It's kind of like the Serenity Prayer it's used in all the 12-step support group meetings, but it's really well known in the wider community. It's grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And Ronald Niebauer, the man who kind of coined this whole thing, it's a much longer prayer than just the Serenity Prayer, but he also says that recognizing difficulties as a pathway to peace, kind of recognizing that when we find a way to move through our difficulties, to embrace the challenge, and when we see that we're capable of being able to do that, it does provide peace within ourselves. So part of the whole thing when we're kind of looking at our stress is to also sort of take stock of our resiliency. Resiliency, and the next slide kind of talks a little bit more about that. Resiliency is basically the ability to bounce back in the midst of adversity. And one of the things that all branches of the military are doing right now is as we have more and more of our veterans that have returned, that have been exposed to trauma, who have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder or just trauma reactivity. Not everybody that's experienced trauma necessarily has a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, but what the military has really embraced in treating mental health conditions for people who've experienced trauma is to really look at this notion of resiliency. So that's something for you to think about too, is that in times of adversity, how have I been able to navigate that? How have I been able to bounce back? When I've been in a difficult situation and I managed to weather that, or I managed to get through it, how was I able to do that? Look at what your resources are. Look at what it is that helps you get through that, and then you can call upon those things again. The one thing about resiliency is that we can learn resiliency. We can develop resiliency. And this next slide talks about that, tips for developing resiliency. So accept what you cannot change. That's what I was saying a minute ago. Put your energy into things that you can control. And there's a lot to be said for that. Let go of the small stuff. You know, with kids, it's oftentimes pick your battle. You know, if you don't like maybe you notice the fact that your child has 2 different colors of socks on, or 2 different shoes, or an outfit that doesn't match. How big a deal is that? Really kind of looking at what's important and what's not important, and maybe it's worrying about all those unimportant things that's causing a lot of stress. Reviewing your interpretation and perception, we've been talking about that. What we've talked about so far is the way you make sense of things, but it's also important to think about perception. It's what we perceive. It's why oftentimes, like in a work environment, you can have 2 people that hear the exact same thing and they perceive it totally differently. And sometimes people will say to one another, well, how did you understand that? Well, I understood it to be this way. No, it's totally different than that. It's perception. Perception is because everything gets run through our own filters and the way we make sense of things. So perception is a really big deal. Another tip for developing resiliency is really paying attention, as we talked about early on, the shoulds, must, ought to, have to. Looking at the situations, at any crisis that may be going on in your home or in your work environment, being able to look at them sometimes as opportunities to grow. What can I learn from this? What skills and abilities do I have that I brought to bear that helped me get through it? And how do I want to learn and grow moving forward? How do I maybe want to challenge my belief systems? How do I want to maybe review some of my perceptions? Some other tips as discussed in this next slide for developing resiliency. Accept that things are happening in a process. You're not always going to know now. You're not always going to know now the outcome of something. It's important to go A to B, B to C, C to D, rather than try to jump from A to M or A to Z. One step at a time, one moment at a time. And it's kind of like sometimes people have 5 different things on their plate. They're like, I do this and this and this and this and this. Research is showing that the subconscious brain cannot focus on more than one thing at a time. So to be most effective, that's the time to say, okay, what do I want to focus on right now? And bring your attention back to that. I have to practice that all the time because I can get really scattered with thinking about everything that I need to be getting done. Trying to be upbeat and positive can help us develop our resiliency. Taking note of pleasant situations when things are working, when things are moving in the direction that I want. What am I doing that's helping that be so? Okay, so let's move into our polling question number 2. Question being, we are born with resiliency and have it or don't from the very beginning. Is that true or false? I'll let Brenda compile those results and report them back.
Okay, it looks like we have 90% of participants voting for false, 10% voting for true.
All right. Boy, you guys are good. You guys are good, and maybe I need to make harder polling questions, huh? No, I'm just teasing you. It's just kind of a chance to sort of take stock of some of it. So we have about 5 more minutes, and I'm going to kind of go through these next things a little more quickly, because I want to make sure we have time at the end for questions and discussion. And I want to hear from you. And if you have some things you want to share about what's working for you, I'd love to hear that too. So some self-care strategies for helping build resiliency, tips for practicing self-care. And you can probably never, ever talk to people enough about self-care, because it's the one thing that people sometimes just don't take the time out for. Make sure you're getting the rest, being able to make sure you're having time for relaxation, building in that breathing that I was talking about. Know your comfort zone, know your boundaries, saying no when you mean no and yes when you mean yes. And if it means saying no and worrying about how somebody's going to feel, yeah, that's okay that you can be concerned about that. But sometimes it means still saying no when you mean no and you want to say no. And for many people, they haven't learned to get very good at saying no. So that might be something worth practicing. Might mean that you're going to get some help when you need it. Again, as I was saying earlier, that's a great use of the EAP. And talking it out. You know, if you've decided, if you kind of do some of the examining, the contemplation, the inquiry that we're talking about here, tuning in, you realize, wow, I'd really like to get some support or kind of take some committed action toward this. I want to, I value this, and I want to take committed action toward what I value most, but I'm struggling with that. That might be a really great use of the EAP. I would encourage that. Other self-care ideas, as we talk about in the next slide, maybe joining a gym, going for a walk, trying a yoga class. It might be meditating. It might be journaling. It might be taking up a new hobby. Might be watching a really funny movie or a really tender movie. It might be a documentary or, a movie based on a true story that's very heartwarming. Some people might be shopping, just going out and kind of wandering around. Doesn't necessarily mean buying anything. It might be a sporting event or a concert, getting a massage, finding something for you that's truly self-care. Not a should, not a have to, not a must, not an oughta, but this is something I really enjoy. So if going to the gym is more of this is what I feel like I really need to be doing for myself, make sure you're balancing it also with something that's just pure fun, pure pleasure, and having those opportunities too. So a few highlights here, kind of as we're kind of wrapping things up. Recognize your stressors. Tune in. Are they physical, mental, emotional, intellectual, relational, behavioral? Tune in and see maybe what they are. Notice how you're reacting to it. Are you yelling? Are you screaming? Are you shutting down? Is your body, heart pounding and your stomach churning and your fists clenched? Notice kind of what your reaction is. Notice how you're taking care of yourself. Am I taking care of myself in some of the ways that we've outlined in this discussion today? What is my self-talk? What am I telling myself? Am I telling myself I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not pretty enough, I'm not this enough? Anytime we're kind of criticizing or judging ourselves, then we're tearing ourselves down. So noticing, are there some things I can say and appreciate about myself? And appreciating the small things. Doesn't have to be big things. Using positive self-talk, using imagining, yes, I can do it. Yes, I will do it. I am doing it. Think of some new ways in your home environment to do chores, to divvy up the responsibilities. Maybe it's going to mean letting go of some things that you've always kind of felt compelled to do. It's just that reevaluation. It's a continual reevaluation. Just because things have always been a certain way doesn't mean that we need to keep doing in the same way. Kind of, I have this motto: if it's working, do more of it. If it's not working, do something different. And just one step in a new direction is going to create the momentum to get going in a new direction. It doesn't have to be big, just one little thing in a new direction. An action step is what creates the momentum. This last slide lists a couple of resources. Bioenergetics, Alexander Lowen, How to Get Control of Your Time and Your Life by Alan Lakin, and definitely our EAP, our website, and then calling and scheduling with somebody. So, all right. So now we have some time here at the end. Would love to hear any comments, feedback, questions that people have. And because keep in mind, if there's something that you're wondering about, it's likely that there's somebody else on the call that maybe is wondering the same thing. So would love to hear any ideas or any questions that you may have. Do we have anything coming in, Brenda?
Just people wanting to know whether or not we'll be sending out a copy of the PowerPoint slides following the presentation. And I'll be sending those out, yes, just this afternoon. And also a link to the archived webinar on our YouTube channel. So look for those.
Perfect. What about for those of you that are staying with us here, what about sharing something that you're doing that really is helping you manage your stress? What you're doing well to manage this. I'd love to hear that, because that might be something that could be really helpful for others, and that could be either in your work environment or your home environment.
So Brenda, could you elaborate a little bit on incorporating the idea of gratitude into stress reduction?
Oh, absolutely. And whoever wrote in about that, thank you, thank you, thank you. Was that a show of gratitude? You know, I have this book. It's called Attitude of Gratitude. And what happens what happens when we can move into gratitude, and gratitude just sort of is kind of as a way of kind of coming up with the definition to a way to think about it, is it's appreciation. It's appreciation and acknowledgement of something that really touches our hearts. And so what happens is when we can come from a place of gratitude, acknowledging gratitude, whether it's our coworker, whether it's our intimate partner, whether it's our child, whether it's our friendship, what happens is not only does that impact the connection and the bond with that person or those persons, but it also kind of expands our heart. And when we can, you know, I know this sounds kind of a little bit woo-woo-y, but we can either be coming from our head, which is our intellect, it's our ability to analyze, it's our ability to think about things, and then we come from our hearts. That's where we feel. We can feel deeply. I mean, think about those times when you felt the most loving and connected with someone, and think about what that felt like, or does feel like, if you can think of somebody right now. Well, when we express or experience gratitude. And whether that's an outward expression or an inward acknowledgement and appreciation, we're expanding the heart, our compassion. Like I started a have a gratitude program when I was a program administrator for a program once. We just did these little half sheets, a piece of paper where it said, I saw and appreciate what you did, and and then you would fill in what it was. And then it was across 5 different agencies, and so pretty soon it was a way for people to connect with one another across agencies. It was a way for people to acknowledge one another, because we tend to live in a society and a culture that's focused on problems. And part of being problem focused is because it's part of the fear response. It's part of our survival mechanism. We're kind of conditioned and programmed to be wired toward anticipating the worst. So we tend to focus more on looking for problems. So when we're focused on gratitude, we're looking for what we can take that moment out to appreciate, whether it's the sun that came out, whether it's that I feel warm and cozy. It's the little things, and it's tuning in, taking that moment out to acknowledge them. And it's part of resiliency too, because it's restorative. It's the thing that helps us to, kind of in challenging times, and certainly, we've got some challenging times going on that we're in the midst of. It helps us feel restored and can help us emotionally, physically, mentally, relationally, on all levels. And some people will take that moment right before they go to bed at night. What is something, or what are 3 things that I really appreciate, or that I want to give gratitude for today? For some people, gratitude might become prayer, depending on your own particular kind of leanings and preferences. There can be some real similarities between those 2. So thank you for asking that question. Anything else, Brenda?
No, I don't see that we have any other questions.
All right. I want to share, since we still have about 2 minutes left, I'm going to share a personal experience. And some of you may have heard me tell this story on a webinar I did in the past, but at the end of my freshman year in college, I worked as a counselor at a ranch camp for what the psychologists that ran the program called for exceptional children. They would be children that sort of in today's system would be called severely mentally disabled, emotionally and mentally disturbed, I guess, was sort of the title then. And what our goals, we camped out in the woods and had all kinds of adventures. And his goal was to have all these children who had a lot of abuse history, a lot of them were in foster homes, to have a positive experience. And so the goal was ignore all negative behavior and focus on positive behavior. And so what I noticed when I was charged with just focusing on the positive was pretty soon I got to see it in everybody, and I got to see it all the time, and I got to see it in even some of the kids that were the most challenged, including the one that hit me over the back of the head with a dump truck, a toy truck. And so it's kind of like, in a way, it's a little bit like gratitude, in that the more we can tune in and pay attention to kind of what the positives are and what's working, it expands our ability to be able to see it as well. And it totally forever changed my life and my philosophy of life. So with that, I wish you all the best. I encourage you to maybe just think about 1 or 2 things that could be a takeaway from this. Something maybe you want to contemplate, consider, if there's an action step that you might want to take, because it's that action step in that really gets that momentum going in a new direction. And if there's any ways that the EAP we can support you in the process, please don't hesitate to give a call. And I certainly want to wish you all the very best in your next steps forward with any of these things that you may want to embrace or incorporate. All the best to you. Take good care. Bye-bye.